Why is it so hard to get information from the IRS? Does the IRS really try to protect my information? Can I get help dealing with the IRS? We will answer these questions and more as we wrap up the Taxpayer Bill of Rights series today. This is the last of our three-part series on the Taxpayer Bill of Rights. Parts 1 and 2 are linked in the description below if you have not seen them or would like to go back and have a quick refresher. It's been a quick minute since we've started this series. The Taxpayer Bill of Rights is a list of rights that each taxpayer is entitled to when they have to deal with the IRS. These rights include the right to be informed, the right to quality service, the right to pay no more than the correct amount of tax, the right to challenge the IRS's position and be heard, the right to appeal an IRS decision in an independent forum, the right to finality, the right to privacy, the right to confidentiality, the right to retain representation, and the right to a fair and just tax system. Today, we will focus on the last four, all of which are important, but it also includes my personal favorite: the right to privacy, the right to confidentiality, the right to retain representation, and the right to a fair and just tax system. The first right we'll talk about today is the right to privacy. Taxpayers have the right to expect that any IRS inquiry, examination, or enforcement action will comply with the law and be no more intrusive than necessary, and will respect all due process rights, including search and seizure protections, and will provide, where applicable, a collection due process hearing. The right to privacy covers what most people would expect, that any right by the IRS will be no more intrusive than it has to be. If you are being examined for 1 year, you should only have to provide records for that year, with a big caveat that is unless the IRS has good reason to request records for another year, or to expand the exam to cover them. In some situations, it is necessary for the IRS to request records from other tax years in order to be able to determine if the current tax return is correct. For instance, when reviewing an research and development tax credit, the accuracy of the base period calculation and the manner in which it was calculated is integral to the determination. This requires the IRS to regularly request information from prior years, sometimes prior decades, in order to be able to complete the exam. In addition to this, the right to privacy also provides that all due process rights, including search and seizure protections, will be applicable. If the IRS intends to seize your property, it has to follow certain procedures that are laid out in the Internal Revenue Code, and that we will go into in more detail in another video, before it can do so. Next is the right to confidentiality. Taxpayers have the right to expect that any information they provide to the IRS will not be disclosed unless authorized by the taxpayer or by law. Taxpayers have the right to expect appropriate action will be taken against employees, return preparers, and others who wrongfully use or disclose taxpayer return information. The right to confidentiality is why you can send sensitive information to the IRS and not worried about it being released publicly or released to others. The IRS has numerous rules protecting taxpayer information, and that information is protected by federal statute. It is important to note that this includes, in many cases, even protecting your information from other branches of federal government. Now, this is not perfect, but the IRS has one of the best reputations for not leaking sensitive information. This is why when leaks do happen, it is such a big deal. Pro-Republica stories from the last few years talking about the tax returns of wealthy individuals is likely from a leak at the IRS, and that leak could result in jail time for the IRS employee or employees that are responsible. This is also the reason that it can be so hard to deal with the IRS. The IRS has to be sure that you are either who you say you are and consequently are allowed to access that information, or that you have proper authorization by the taxpayer. So if I'm representing somebody, I have to have the authorization on file with the IRS before they will even speak to me. Unfortunately, the IRS's verification process leaves a lot to be desired, both in terms of technology as well as efficiency. Next, we have the right to retain representation. Taxpayers have the right to retain an authorized representative of their choice to represent them during their dealings with the IRS. Taxpayers have the right to seek assistance from a low-income taxpayer clinic if they cannot afford representation. For what should be obvious reasons as a tax attorney, this is my favorite right. Much like in the criminal justice system, taxpayers also have a right to representation before the IRS. If a taxpayer cannot afford the assistance of a CPA, EA, or attorney, they can seek help from the local low-income taxpayer clinic. As a note, these clinics are awesome. They are run by tax attorneys who are actively practicing and staffed by law students who are gaining experience under the direction of those tax attorneys. They provide a lot of help for low-income taxpayers. To continue on, you're always entitled to representation when dealing with IRS, and in general, I strongly recommend it. There are some great IRS agents, but there are many that are undertrained and too inexperienced to know that they are doing more harm than good. Having experienced representation can be crucial in getting a good outcome in your dealings with IRS. And finally, we have the right to a fair and just tax system. Taxpayers have the right to expect the tax system to consider facts and circumstances that might affect their underlying liabilities, ability to pay, or ability to provide information timely. Taxpayers have the right to receive assistance from the Taxpayer Advocate Service if they are experiencing financial difficulty or if the IRS has not resolved their tax issue properly and timely through its normal channels. The final right primarily means that the facts and circumstances of each taxpayer should be taken into account when dealing with the IRS. The situation is going to be different from your neighbors, and that will not only affect how much you owe, but also your ability to pay and your ability to provide documents and information in a timely manner. Additionally, this also means that you have the right to receive help from the Taxpayer Advocate Service if you are having issues getting a resolution from the IRS. While it's well beyond the scope of this video, the Taxpayer Advocate is an independent section of the IRS that is tasked with helping taxpayers with unresolved issues. Much like the rest of the IRS, the advocates are overwhelmed right now, but they do play an important role and can be a very helpful resource in certain situations. And that wraps it up for the Taxpayer Bill of Rights. In total, 10 rights that have been granted to each taxpayer, all of which impact how the IRS and taxpayers interact. If you have questions about your rights or any of the information presented in this series, leave a comment below or reach out to me directly. My contact information is in the description below. Have a great day.